Welcome again, guys, back to Code Archive. This is programming channel where we have a playlist on different programming areas, and you can always click on the playlist of your interest and watch along from at the beginning fundamental concept to more advanced concepts of each of the programming areas. This is the first lesson on Spring Boot MVC, and in this first lesson, we want to take a look at introduction to Spring Boot framework, and then in the subsequent lessons, we will build Spring Boot applications, and then we will be able to move on to a more advanced concept of Spring Boot framework. So without wasting time, let me turn to the slide and then present some of the introduction to Spring Boot framework. So guys, before we look at the programming and writing the code and building the Spring Boot application, building the RESTful APIs and building the RESTful applications, let us first take a first lesson and introduce the concept of Spring Boot, look at what is Spring Boot, what are some of the advantages, and how does it compare with the other Spring framework. Then from there, we can start writing our first Spring Boot application. So Spring Boot is basically a framework which is built for, which is created to help build web-based RESTful applications. And this framework is built on top of a Spring framework. And the Spring framework is also another framework which is built on top of the Java language. Therefore, you realize that the prerequisite to Spring Boot is you need to have fundamental understanding of Java programming language before you look into Spring Boot. So if you don't have any fundamental knowledge about Java, I would advise you go and watch a tutorial playlist on Java fundamentals, and then after that you check out this resource on Spring Boot web MVC. And Spring Boot is basically a framework which is a combination. We've said it is a combination of the Spring framework, and it comes with an embedded HTTP server. This server can be Tomcat, it can be Jetty server, it can be Netty server, or any server of that matter. So when you talk about a Spring Boot, it is a framework which is a combination of a Spring framework and embedded server. With the Spring framework, we don't have embedded servers, but with the Spring Boot, it comes with the HTTP servers, which you can use to test your applications during development. Spring Boot has also evolved from version 1, the first version of Spring Boot, to the current version we have is version 3.0.5. So this is the current stable version of Spring Boot. And then you see that these are some of the few advantages of this framework, Spring Boot, and it helps us to create standalone applications that we can then use, we can start or run them using the jar files. It also provides embedded servers, we have said, and this will help us to test and run our applications. Spring Boot also provides some production features which can help you to track your application in production. So when you develop your application and deploy it on production, you will be able to benefit from so many features which is provided by Spring. And these features are very useful when it comes to administering your applications and monitoring your application. Spring Boot also does not require the XML configuration during deployment. With the Spring framework, you realize that when you finish building your application, then you have to configure the XML file before you finally deploy the application. But with the Spring Boot framework, it comes with the auto configuration feature, which does not require you to configure XML configuration during deployment. And then another good advantage of Spring Boot is that it simplifies Maven configurations through what is called the status. We have the status. We have, when you create a new Spring Boot application, it will add the parent starter, and that parent starter will then in turn help you to add and reconfigure or to configure the other dependencies that you are going to add. Spring Boot also helps us to reduce a lot of boilerplate code, and this is the nice thing with the Spring Boot framework. And then you can see this is the brief comparison between Spring Framework and the Spring Boot framework. So you can see these are the main comparisons and the differences that in the sense that Spring Boot supports, it is mainly used for building Java EE applications or enterprise applications. Spring Boot is used mainly for building REST APIs, and this is what we are going to build. Spring Boot comes with the auto configuration feature, while Spring has only the dependency feature. The Spring Framework does not have embedded server that we've seen. On the other hand, Spring Boot comes with embedded server, which is a very nice feature. The Spring Boot also provides in-memory database, which we can use to test our application during the development stage. And we shall see that when we write our code, while this feature is not present in the Spring Framework. So you can see this is the comparison feature, which tells the improved features of Spring Boot over the Spring. And the Spring was built mainly for the three goals. One is to avoid the XML configuration so that we don't have to configure the XML configurations during deployment. It is also built to reduce the amount of imports, avoiding to import a lot of classes, and also to avoid defining a lot of annotations on the classes that we are defining. Spring Boot also has this number of features. It has web development feature. It has application events and application listeners. It has the administration features. It has the feature of externalized configuration. It also has the feature of properties. It provides both the properties file and the YAML file, which we can use to configure our application properties. And then it also has a type-safe configuration, and it also provides a logging feature, which will enable your application to log the events and to log all the activities that happen on your application. Spring Boot also provides a strong security feature, which you can use to secure your applications. And apart from the Spring Boot framework, Spring also comes with a lot of modules which will help us to build our REST application. So one of the modules which we have seen is the Spring Boot. And then Spring also has another module called the Spring Data, which through the JPA or Hibernate ORM, we are able to use that module to access the data and manipulate the data in our database. Spring also provides a Spring security module for securing our applications. And let's say Spring comes with a Spring Web and the Spring Batch modules for performing the batch process capabilities and helping us to make the HTTP request and HTTP responses. So this, apart from these few modules, there are other many modules which we will look into as we start implementing the code in the upcoming videos. So this is all about a brief introduction to Spring Boot. We have put the link for this lesson. You can click on that link and get more resources which will explain in more detail about the Spring framework and the Spring Boot framework, so that you can be able to read it at your own pace. So I would like us to stop in this particular video, and in the next video, which is lesson 2, we will take a look at the Spring Boot architecture before we can start implementing that architecture. So guys, up to this point, have a nice time and see you in the next video. Also, if you find this content useful, consider sharing it with a friend who is interested in tech. And if you have any question, you can type it under in form of a comment, and we will be able to answer it and send you the feedback. Guys, thanks for watching, and welcome back again.